Okay, so the meeting has started recording. Okay, so why the emphasis in MfL at the moment? On the first slide, you can see a quote which is taken from the 2021 Curriculum Research Review for Languages by Ofsted. Clear and reliable pronunciation and the links between sounds and spellings are an integral part of second language learning. I don't think as language teachers, any of us would disagree with this statement. We know to have confident speakers of a language is really important. And I think it's one of the things that students feel most excited about getting to grips with. But each of us in our departments probably take a different approach to teaching phonics. And this session is certainly not about saying there's a one specific way to teach phonics. It's just thinking about how we do it and maybe how we can improve on what we do or change what we do to best suit our learners and to best suit the needs of the new GCSE to be first examined in 2026. So the little image at the bottom, some of you might have clocked and thought you recognise what I might be referring to. So phonics is one of Ofsted's 3 pillars of language learning alongside grammar and vocabulary. And in their report, they mention the word phonics 21 times. But this isn't something that's just come up yesterday. It's got a little bit of a long history, which I'll go into in a couple of moments' time. So just as I kind of mentioned earlier, what we are going to do this afternoon is have a look at the role of phonics in relation to Ofsted, the new GCSE, and teaching in languages more generally. Some different approaches to teaching phonics, and of course thinking about where does this fit in with vocabulary and grammar more generally. So I'm just going to give you a minute or so to read through the following bullet points taken from the 2021 report that I was just referring to. So you might think this is quite an explicit reference to, according to Ofsted, the importance of phonics and how that features in what they call a high quality languages education. And reflecting on your curriculum plans, your scheme for learnings, your medium term plans, it might maybe cause a bit of panic thinking about, well, maybe I haven't got a clear, my curriculum plan doesn't necessarily show the phonics that we are going to include. Maybe you've mentioned phonics, but not necessarily the progression between them. And the second bullet point, maybe you haven't mentioned where you're going to review specific ones of these. And I'm not showing you this to cause panic and to think, oh, I need to add a new section into my scheme for learning, but it's certainly something that you want to be able to talk about and justify in those conversations with either senior leaders in your school, or if you are visited by Ofsted, they're going to want to know how you are meeting this and how you are setting your students up to be successful in their knowledge of phonics and phonemes and graphemes. Just to kind of make it clear that we have phonemes is the sound itself, and graphemes is the written representation of that sound. I'm not going to refer to those in detail, but just so you know. And as I've already mentioned, this isn't just from 2021. This hasn't appeared out of nowhere. And it probably goes all the way back to 2016, which is, of course, the first year of teaching of the new GCSE exam, with the first exams were sat in 2018. So in 2016, as well as the first year of the new GCSE, the Teaching Schools Council did a review into modern foreign languages, and they found a number of things, including what they felt was, a weakness in the teaching of phonics. A year later in 2017 is the creation of the MfL Hub network, followed the following year by the NCELP, which, if you're not sure, is the National Centre of Excellence in Language Pedagogy. You might have heard that term around a lot in the last kind of 6 months, because they have been producing a lot of schemes of learning, a lot of resources based on kind of this new, based on the research and the review from this Ofsted review in 2021. It's also followed by the fact that in summer of 2019, only 40% of students were entered for the EBAC, and that's really far away from the government's 90% aim by 2027. And then there's another subject content review in November 2019, and obviously the decision to kind of redo the GCSE. So this push on phonics is got quite a political background, as many things in education do. But it's not really what I want to focus on, because we understand as language teachers that phonics are important if we want well-rounded, confident language learners. But what we do have to bear in mind, of course, is that the new specification GCSE will be explicitly will be explicitly testing our students' understanding of phonics, or what they refer to sometimes as sound symbol correspondences, or SSC. So we'll take a look at the new assessment objectives for the new GCSE. And we have our 3 AOs as opposed to the 4 that we're used to at the moment. So AO1, understand and respond to spoken language in speaking and in writing. And if you have had a look at the kind of the subject content report from the DFE, then you will understand that responding to spoken language in writing is referring to a dictation task in the GCSE. And for AO2, understanding and responding to written language in speaking is referring to a reading aloud task as part of the speaking exam. Now, because the exam boards haven't published their proposed papers, although they have said they would in autumn 2022, so hopefully not that long away, we don't know exactly what these will look like. However, it does specify that the dictation will include some unknown words, as in words that aren't on the specification, to ensure that students are being really tested on that sound spelling link, as opposed to them just remembering how a word is spelt or said. And alongside that, it also says that the students will be given credit for accurate spelling. If you're a French teacher in here, you might already be thinking, oh, this is going to be potentially much harder for a language like French, where the the sound symbol correspondences are a little bit more complicated when you have a plethora of silent letters. That is something the exam board have said they have taken into consideration. But once again, we are a little bit stabbing in the dark until we've actually seen some papers. In terms of the reading aloud, it simply says at the moment, read aloud a short written text and undertake a short unprepared conversation related to it. So that seems like it will be something similar to the photo card, but rather than do responses related to a photo, they will have questions related to the text that they have just read out. And just one thing to note here, which is encouraging, is that although these AOs have the slightly unhelpful different percentages, it is likely that the exam boards are still going to produce 4 papers across the 4 different skills. So that should make it a little bit more straightforward. So before I move on to the kind of strategy section of this CPD session this afternoon, I'm just going to spend a minute on the next 3 slides to show you what has been published by the DFE in their subject content. So on our first one, these are the list of the French sound symbol correspondences that they've said GCSE students could be examined on. I did have a look and there was nothing in there about differences for higher and foundation tier. So presumably at either tier, students could be asked to write down or read out words which contain these sound symbol correspondences. It is interesting to note in there, which I put it in orange, is the kind of use of liaisons and the fact that students are going to be marked on those or gain credit for them, probably one of the more challenging aspects to teach. I'll move on now and let you take a look at the German one and then finally the Spanish one. And I'll just move on to the Spanish one. And then finally, there is just one more bit for the Spanish, which looks like the most simple so far, but they've got an extra bit of information about the stress position and what they would expect from students in that. So again, I'll just leave this up for 30 seconds for you to have a scan through. Okay, so in relation to this, the exam boards have done a number of meetings, some in person and some surveys online, to try and gauge MfL teachers' responses to this, their queries, things they like, things they don't like. And I came across a conversation recently with an AQA representative who was responding to the following question that had been asked. Will students have the opportunity to practice reading the passage aloud before the exam? So in response to this, because understandably, teachers want their students to be able to have a go at saying it before it is the kind of marked condition. Well, for a start, we don't know for sure because the specimen papers haven't been released yet. And the AQA representative in the conversation did express some logistical concerns in allowing, in giving students the chance to practice out loud. So, for example, larger centres or centres with at least 2 languages running at the same time will often have at least 2 students doing their speaking exam preparation at the same time. And for the sake of logistics and money and time, that's normally at least 2 students in a room with perhaps 1 or 2 invigilators. Obviously, if you have 2 students preparing at the same time, it's not going to be possible for them to practice reading it out loud as part of their preparation time. Although this is speculation for now. It does link into one of the strategies that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So it's just something worth bearing in mind, but obviously something that we'll get more clarification on as we get closer to the cohort, the current year 8 cohort taking these exams. But of course, everyone is not here just because they think that what Ofsted's telling them is the only thing they have to do, but I'm sure it's because that you understand that as language teachers, if we want our students to be successful, they want to be confident speakers and readers. And as well, if we don't work on their phonics, those listening skills are going to potentially really suffer as well. So I read a really interesting blog by Steve Smith, who was writing specifically about the changes in the roles in phonics. And he referred to this study in 2014, which was of 360 novice students of French, as in they were in year 7 and they were in 2 English comprehensive schools. So it's not a huge study, but it's a decent amount of students. As you can see, the findings were not particularly strong. So in a test of rhyming words, the average score for students was less than 3 out of 14. 7% of the students, only 7% of the students, said that they felt happy when reading French aloud in the lesson. And of course, the vast majority felt negatively about decoding, spelling, and spelling written French. As well as these findings that suggest that students aren't very happy in a lot of circumstances to read out loud, there's also other research that indicates that when early learners of a language have a strong phonological awareness, then that is a good predictor of their fluency in later years. So unless any of you kind of work in primary and can start to build that in already, when we get these students in year 7, one of our key priorities maybe should be getting them to have a good understanding of the link between what they are reading and what they are saying, so that we can set them up to be stronger learners in the rest of their years. And hopefully, as I'm sure you can guess from that survey, it means we're going to have more motivation and more confidence. If our students feel happy about reading, it can be really successful and a really nice emotion for them. And if we are in schools where uptake at GCSE is maybe not where we'd like it to be, phonics might be a good starting place to improve the confidence and self-efficacy of those students in your classroom. So that kind of brings us on to, well, what do you currently do in your classroom, and what else might you try in your classroom to think about developing your students' phonological awareness? I've already mentioned the NCELP and the fact that they have produced resources. So this organisation is very closely linked with the development of the new GCSE content, and they have produced whole schemes of learning and lessons that some schools have chosen to adopt. Some people in the language teaching profession like to polarize the different approaches in language teaching, NCLP, Conti, pretending like they can have nothing nothing similar, but I don't think that's necessarily always a helpful approach to take. And actually, it's probably better to look at different approaches and think what is going to work in our context, and is there anything that we can learn from that. So if you are thinking, right, we're not doing much for phonics and I want to get started, these are some really useful fully produced resources which you could dip into and add into your schemes for learning. So not only do they have all of the sound symbol correspondences, which I showed you on a few slides previously, but they also have a suggested sequence for introducing the different sounds. And when you look at the resources, they have tried to think about that really closely in line with things like retrieval practice and recall. So for example, in the PowerPoints, they make an effort to not introduce any sound symbol correspondences that haven't previously been taught. One of the founders of NCLP is Rachel Hawkes, who a lot of you who've been teaching for a few years will probably know the name, and she has previously developed a lot of phonics resources which you might have used at various times in your teaching career. The slides do have built-in recordings, and they've got detailed instructions for how you might deliver them, and I can share a link to directly access those as well. But we need to think about how these might fit in with our teaching, and so I'd ask you to just maybe consider, when you get a student in year 7, what are the first words or phrases that you teach them? You might be going in with introductions, you might be going in with a slightly different topic like school, and perhaps there are some sound symbol correspondences from our list that we looked at earlier that students find difficult to master. Maybe there's a couple of slides or activities that you think, actually, if we could get this right at the beginning, then it's going to really help them progress and feel confident at the beginning of their language learning. And is there any room in your current practice to build in some explicit phonics practice to start creating confident learners and speakers? So this NCLP resources are kind of a, here you go, and you can just embed them straight away. You might think, for example, if you are teaching Spanish and it's year 7 and you're doing introductions, well, maybe you want to include some of the slides for the ñ, so tengo 11 años, or the double L, so me llamo, and really just spending 10 minutes of your lesson might have a big impact and hopefully not be that much work to implement as well. On the other hand, we could look at perhaps a different approach, which is more embedded into your current curriculum practices. So lots of the departments in the trust work with sentence builders a la Conti, and even if you're not using sentence builders, you'll definitely be creating text or choosing text to introduce your students to the language. So ask yourself the following question. When you are creating your sentence builder or your text, do you explicitly consider the phonics which are appearing in that text? Do you tend to make explicit reference to these in your teaching? And have you planned when you might re-expose the students to certain sound symbol correspondences? I'm aware that some of you will be in classrooms with your colleagues, so I'd like to give you 2 minutes now, and if you're perhaps by yourself, maybe just to jot down some ideas or just think about it. Have you ever done this, or do the sound symbol correspondences completely come randomly? And it's no judgment either way, it's just an interesting thing to think about. So I just give you a little bit of time to reflect on these questions. So I'm going to now share an example from a head of department, a teacher who, depending on how much you look online or follow blogs, you may well be familiar with, Esmeralda Salgado. and she blogs a lot about her approach with EPI and lexicogrammar. And she gives the following example of when they introduce names in their Spanish lessons, that she tries to pick names that have certain sound symbol correspondences. So introducing yourself, sentence builder, choosing the names Alejandro, Hector, Ramon. Sorry, I'm not a Spanish specialist, so if I didn't do a very good job of those. And it's something that made me really reflect when I was reading the blog. I thought, I don't personally think that that is something that I have considered before when I'm creating my resources. And actually, it's a really easy way of targeting specific sound symbol correspondences from the very beginning. And so, although you haven't necessarily chosen to have a separate slide in your PowerPoint or separate activities on one sound symbol correspondence, we can think carefully and expose our students to this. And depending on the type of approach you take, then there's a whole range of activities that could then be followed up. And again, this is taken from the same blog here, and we're thinking about the modelling section. So if you do follow a Mars ears approach, a la Conti, these are some of the activities that Esmeralda mentions in her blog. So something we all do in language teachings, the repetitions of the language, okay, our choral repetitions, getting all the students to join in. Now, as much as recognizing sound symbol correspondences is useful for students, some of the research does suggest that by saying it out loud, it actually helps to strengthen the memory. And I think that's pretty common sense, but maybe something that we take for granted sometimes in the classroom. Dictations, well, we know it's going to be part of the final GCSE, but you can have a lot of fun with it in your lesson as well. So thinking about delayed dictations, trying to get the students to hold it in their short-term memory or their working memory for 5 seconds before they have to try and write it down. Gapped dictations. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you are gapping whole words out. Perhaps you're really focusing on 2 or 3 different phonics and you just gap out a portion of the word. For example, it would probably work really well with those tricky combinations of vowels in French. If you're doing things like numbers and ages, you could gap out the U and the I in huit, okay? And then the students are trying to test, well, what is that huit sound in there? Similarly with the O and the I, the A and the U, etc. And then pyramid dictations, not something that I've personally tried, but sounds like a really nice way of scaffolding the kind of length and the exposure to the words and the sounds that you're thinking about. And also, of course, a way of just repeating, so the students get as much exposure to it as possible. Minimal pairs is an activity that Steve Smith writes a little bit about. If you've got a copy of Breaking the Sound Barrier, these are like all in here, and they're also on a lot of blogs available as well. So getting students to try and hear and decipher the difference between these words that sound really similar but have the different spelling. So déjà, déjà. Super minimal for us as, you know, there may be like native speakers or people with a lot of experience in the language. It's much easier for us, but that's something really challenging for the students. And as well, so then she goes on to talk about how we can emphasize our teaching of phonics, not only in the modeling stage of the lesson, but in the structured practice phase, which involves a lot of these different reading aloud activities. Some of which you might be familiar with, but I'll just run through a couple of them now. So obviously, mind reader is super easy. Sentence stealers, these are kind of classic Conti activities, and the students have something to read from. It's not asking them to produce the language, but it is asking them to think really carefully about how they are saying it. Trapdoor speaking activities do exactly the same thing. Lots of repeated exposure. Students like getting competitive with each other. And I think, well, if I reflect on my own practice, when I started teaching, I didn't really understand the importance of activities like this. And I thought, well, the student is just reading aloud, they're not having to think hard enough. But actually, that's not the case at all. And they are having to think hard if they are thinking about their pronunciation. If some of you attended the session I did last year on metacognition, and we mentioned rhubarb, which is, I don't know if it has an official name. This is an old colleague of mine who called the game rhubarb. It's really easy, and you might play a variation already. So your students are reading out a text, and as soon as one of them as soon as they think one of their friends or their peers makes a mistake, the student calls out rhubarb. But importantly, they then have to be able to correctly pronounce the word instead. You wouldn't necessarily think that it goes a long way, but even in year 11, there's students who were taught by this teacher in year 7, 8, and 9, and they still ask to play it. It just goes down really, really well. And then on maybe a slightly more complicated activity is the critical listening and speaking, which is also in breaking the sound barrier, which is a really nice one to get students thinking a bit more metacognitively about their speaking. So for this last activity, you as the teacher would model a text, and the idea is that this text is flooded with sounds that the students are already familiar with. And you could then, once you have modelled reading the text, you give the students a set amount of time to practice reading it aloud, trying to work out problems of the words that they're unsure of, and they could work with a partner to do this as well. You could then either read the text again yourself or play a recording of yourself reading the text. The suggested activity in the book, which you might not choose to do, is the students then record themselves, but depending on your setup, like that just might not be possible. And then they listen back and improve and identify areas for improvement. You could very easily manipulate this to be more manageable in a classroom of 30 students. Rather than recording themselves and listening back, you can do that work in pairs. You might want to be thinking carefully about your pairs or your seating plans, because obviously the stronger student is going to find it a lot easier to provide feedback than the other. And then part of the kind of metacognitive cycle, is always quite nice to try and get students to kind of write down some targets, or at least think about how they would like to improve their speaking for the next time. There are more activities than this, and you might be thinking of one at the moment that you've read about, you've seen, or maybe you've even done in your classroom that you're like, actually, I think I could just manipulate this activity slightly to make a bit more emphasis on the phonics, because maybe I'm focusing too much on meaning and not enough on phonics as we go through. And so, speaking of metacognition, which I've just talked about a little bit, and perhaps the restrictions that we don't know yet in the GCSE, links me on to another method which I know some of you are very familiar with and others of you might not use it at all, and that is the kind of the acronym techniques. So the original one on the left is Barry Smith's, and as in famously helped introduce and set up Michaela, now or then set up or turned around a school, Great Yarmouth, and he blogs a lot and has done a few podcasts about cuddles and using it to help students be confident speakers. There is many alternatives to this, but it's basically the same idea, that students learn a technique to help them decode the words that they are seeing. I thought this might be particularly useful in relation to the idea that the students in their GCSE might not have the opportunity to read the passage aloud before going in the exam. So perhaps as a GCSE technique, or lower down the school, depending on where your emphasis are, training the students students in some sort of strategy like these on the slide might help really with that confidence and bringing around success when they have to try and see a blind text for the first time and they're going to have to read it out loud on a recording. It's already quite a stressful environment, and if they've got those annotations on there, that might really help them to be successful. So I've gone through a fair few strategies, and I don't want us to think of phonics as like, yes, like either I'm going to teach it really explicitly and I'm going to have a whole PowerPoint that's just phonics, or I'm never going to do that and it's all going to be embedded. I think we can probably find a nice balance for what works with our students. And I'm just going to give you some more reflection time with a couple more questions to think about from what we've covered in the last kind of 40 minutes. So you may or may not have done any pupil voice, and if you have, it might not have touched on phonics at all. But if you had to guess, what proportion of your students would say that they are happy or confident reading aloud? Would it differ between different groups? What is perhaps more appropriate to your teaching, a slightly more embedded approach or a more standalone approach? Or where might you fall on the spectrum between the two? And what are the most common pronunciation errors that you hear in your classroom? Is there a strategy that we've mentioned today that you could try in the next week to target these? So again, I'm just going to leave you for a minute and a half. If you're with a colleague, try and have a conversation with them about it. If you're on your own, a quiet reflection, and then I'll come together for some final thoughts in about a minute. Okay, so I just wanted to take the last few minutes of this CPD session this afternoon to try to draw together some of the key threads of what we've talked about this afternoon. So I think one of the main things is balance. It's not just about phonics. Just because there is a change to the GCSE does not mean that it needs to be an overhaul of our curriculums. And everything needs to be done in relation and with our vocabulary, with our grammar, and it's not just a wholesale shift. There's also, of course, no one correct method to teaching phonics. We want to be explicit with our students at various points so that we're really clear. We want to avoid misconceptions, and it's probably helpful when you're planning how you're going to teach phonics. Well, not probably, it's definitely helpful to think about the key concepts when what you think about with vocabulary and grammar. For example, what order am I going to teach these phonics in? And that's probably going to be decided in relation to the content you teach. So if you're starting with introductions, you're probably going to want to focus on those phonics that come up straight away. And then as well, and this links back to what was kind of in that Ofsted report about a good languages teaching, and possibly an area that is lacking in many schools' curriculums at the moment is, where are you going to revisit those sounds? Because as we know, you can teach them once and the students might practice them in that one lesson. But unless you carefully think about where you're going to revisit those, they'll probably get forgotten along the way because they're learning so much all the time. There is, as we've already mentioned, good evidence to suggest that giving students opportunities to sound the words aloud makes them more memorable. So great. Not only are you helping them with their phonics, but you're also helping the vocabulary kind of pillar as well, to call it in the Ofsted terms. Thinking about misconceptions, a study from 2015 also suggested that actually if we don't give them the opportunity to say the word out loud, they'll probably just assign the wrong sounds to it in their head, and then that will be transferred to their long-term memory. And as you know, once it's in their long-term memory, it's much harder to overcome that and reteach the correct sound. So maybe in a lesson you taught today, any new vocabulary or any new sounds, how many opportunities did the students get to say those aloud? Once, twice, none at all? Maybe we just modelled it and we didn't give the students that chance to say it. So providing multiple opportunities to say the words aloud is going to have multiple benefits. In relation to that, I showed you the minimal pair activity earlier, and although that's useful for recognition of phonics, which is particularly useful for the dictation side of it, you want to do those alongside activities that make the students actually produce the words, because that's going to help with their general language proficiency a bit more. And if you're thinking about the balance between maybe the NCELP approach with the explicit phonics teaching and more embedded approach, there is research to suggest that explicit teaching of sound symbol correspondences may be particularly beneficial for our lower attaining students. Whereas students who are naturally very good language learners have very good mimicry skills, and so they might not need that explicit phonics teaching. On the other hand, there are students that find it very difficult to mimic the sounds we're making, and so explicit teaching is going to be more perhaps beneficial for those. So I hope that the session this afternoon has begun your journey of reflecting on your current approach to teaching phonics. Hopefully there's some real strengths that you can reflect on and think, actually, we do this really well, but is there something else we could do? Is it beneficial for all our learners? And if not, what can we do about it? I'm going to stop the recording in a moment, but it's 4:45 now. So if you can spare the last 15 minutes that's planned, maybe you could think about a lesson that you're going to teach next week and the sound symbol correspondences, the phonics that are in that. And if there's something from today's session that you would like to give a go. The recording of this and the slides will be made available, so if there's anything that you want to look back on, you will be able to do so. But I hope you've all had a great start to term, and I'm sure I will see some of you at some later sessions as well. And I'm going to stop the recording, and feel free to get yourself signed out. Thank you.